Hannah Rothschild is joining us. And as we were sort of settling in here, we noticed that for some reason or other, something in the weather, possibly 6 weeks of lockdown, a global pandemic, something has made it a difficult day for lots of people. So we've decided we're going to try and enjoy a discussion about the state of the world. Hannah, how's your world today?
Well, it kind of changes hour by hour. Right now, it's okay. You know, I've had moments today which haven't been so jolly. Maybe it's Monday. Maybe there is such a thing. Is it Monday today? Yeah, maybe there is such a thing as Monday these days.
Well, listen, thank you so much for doing this. I know there are lots of people who are our regular members. Actually, one of the treats of Zoom is that you can hit that gallery view and have a look at everybody else looking. And if you're nosy like me, you can also have a look at them in their kitchens or bedrooms or wherever they are. But if it's your first thinking, I just want to let you know how it works. So I want to make sure that everyone realizes that the idea here is that Hannah has, if you like, arrived in our newsroom. And when we asked Hannah to come and do this, the aim was to talk about her book that was just out, The House of Trelawney, that she would come into the newsroom. And it was really a chance, in the way in which you would when you have an editorial conference, to discuss it. Everyone should weigh in. And those of you who've been to a Think-In will know we have this rather simple rule, just one, which is we're not really asking for questions. We want to hear what you think, your point of view. It should be like a news meeting where everyone exchanges their opinions, their observations. And so too with this evening. You know, we're lucky to be able to talk to Hannah, not just about her book or books. Some of you may have read House of Trelawney. It is extremely entertaining in ways that are, we'll discuss anyway in a moment, The Improbability of Love, The Baroness. But I suppose it's one of those funny things, I imagine, about being a Rothschild. It must be similar, I don't know, Hannah, to being sort of a Gandhi or a Kardashian, that everyone thinks, oh, yes, I know who you are, I just got to be reminded which one you are. And Hannah is the one who's been chair of the National Gallery, she's written books, she's made documentary movies, and of course, one of the big things that she's also engaged in is the philanthropy of the Rothschild family and foundation. And so the course of this evening, we're going to try and touch all of those things. I'm just watching Hannah's face as I realise that I've just referred to in the same breath as a Kardashian. But
no, I'm thrilled. I've obviously always wanted to be a Kardashian, you know. So let's be clear about that.
Very good.
What is a Kardashian anyway?
But everyone who's in the room, can I just say, if you want to weigh in, here's the thing, either do so on the chat, right? If you know how Zoom works, you just tab on the chat, you say something to me. My brilliant colleague, Liz Mosley, is here with us. She's A, waving, and B, typing, and C, recovering from a day of homeschooling. If you don't do it that way, if you don't get hold of us through the chat, just hit the participants tab, right? And you'll see when you hit the participants tab, there's a long list of names, but also a little grey box that says raise hands, right? If you raise your hand, you'll grab my attention and your little blue digital hand will come up and I'll come to you. And I'm going to start by actually just testing whether you're even listening to what I'm saying by asking you a really simple question, which is, do you think that the pandemic makes philanthropy more or less accountable? Do you think that when we've got to fix the world's big problems, when we think about whether that's finding a vaccine or providing the finances to sustain arts and culture, that it means that philanthropists are, if you like, more important in our society, or actually need to be overseen by some form of government or public accountability? Who thinks that philanthropy in this world has become more important? Can you raise your little blue hands if you think it has? One. Ooh. I can see many people, my goodness, unbelievable number of people who think that philanthropy has become much more important. All right, well, should we start there, Hannah? Could you just lower your hand so that I can come to you and you can wave at me? But Hannah, why don't we start there? Can you tell us a little bit about the way you personally, the Rothschilds in general, approach philanthropy and the extent to which it's changing given the pressures on arts and culture, on science, on society now?
Okay. So I mean, as you know, James, it's incumbent on anyone in the Jewish faith, and I think in the Muslim faith, to give away 10% of their earnings and a significant amount of their wealth. So that's something that's been endemic in my family for over 150 years. And it was something I was brought up with. And my father, who's a great inspiration in my life, made it very clear that, you know, it was something that would always be very important. So we have a couple of foundations, some of which are historic and some which have been set up more recently. One of which, the largest of which, is actually based in Israel, and it is for the benefit of all citizens of Israel, which might be Arab, Druze, Bedouin, Jew, whatever. And then we have two which are based here. And so we treat these in a way differently, but not that differently. So we have boards of trustees who help us reach decisions. And we also have people who executives who work and who advise us. So we have a lot of people basically who are helping us reach the right decision. And what we've done in this particular crisis is to set aside amounts of money which we will use for the short, medium and long term. So obviously the short term, we know roughly what those problems are. It might be something as desperate as food banks or people in abusive relationships, or it might be small charities that literally cannot keep their doors open unless they get some assistance. And then in the medium term, we would go in with a, slightly more systematic. And then we're keeping quite a lot aside for the long term, because again, none of us know how this crisis is going to evolve. And it's no point putting everything out now when we might need it further in advance. So in the Israeli one, for example, one of the grants went towards the genetic coding of the virus. Another one will go towards, again, some identification of possibly a vaccine. In the UK, I've been helping the most fantastic scientist called Molly Stevens at Imperial, who is one of the people who's going to do the saliva testing. But similarly, we're also involved in an amazing organisation called Heart of Bucks, which is very grassroots in the Aylesbury area, which is where I live, which is where Wasden Manor is, which we're quite involved with.
And when you think about it, Hannah, I suppose the thing that must be impossible is that the range of organisations that now need money, and to an extent, if you're Bill Gates, you can say, look, I'm focused on science. I've long been focused on pandemics. I've got a foundation that's actually got expertise in some of that, medical research. At the moment, I imagine, given where the Rothschild family and foundation has given money, particularly around the arts, it must be the case that every organisation is in some way or other in financial straits, and it's not clear that the government is going to have the money to be able to step in. It seems unfair to sort of put you on the spot, but how do you try to make distinctions between those organisations that are sort of not just the most needy, but the most worthy? And I appreciate that's the point I was really making about accountable. How do you make that judgment and then explain it?
Well, I think, as I said right at the beginning, we have trustees and we have executives who advise us, because I think that to try and play Lord and Lady Bountiful and decide exactly who should get what on your own would be quite dangerous. And so therefore we rely very heavily on the advice of others. And also you have to coordinate efforts with other charities and with other organizations. Otherwise everyone's falling over each other.
Yes.
To achieve something. And I think that's particularly now, one has to be quite careful and measured about what you give to for that reason. I mean, we can't just scattergun, although you would, one would long to help absolutely everybody possible. I think to be measured and to be informed is incredibly important.
Is there a way, and by the way, I can see lots of people, actually quite a few people I know who are deeply involved in art or theatre, who'll be thinking probably quite anxiously about exactly this question about how cultural institutions are sustained through this. So do please weigh in either in the chat or just raise your hand. But Hannah, just reflecting on your time at the National Gallery and chairing the National Gallery, you know, this was already a complicated financial arrangement to sustain these great cultural institutions. Have you given much thought to what happens next?
Oh yeah.
To sustain them? Where are we, and what do you think should happen next?
Well, I mean, what do I think? What I think should happen is that the cultural institutions should get a huge amount of support from the government. That's what I think should happen. I personally think that cultural institutions are frontline, and they are unbelievably important for our health, for our wealth, for our future. I think they're as important as many other institutions. So if you could, or if we would want to imagine a world without a museum or without a theatre or without a concert, I mean, is that the kind of world any of us want to live in, I would ask. And personally, I would say no. And different arts institutions will face different issues. So if I talk about the National Gallery is a lucky position in that it's one building, a good roof, a reasonable endowment, a very stable director, and an exhibition program that can fluctuate according to how much money it has. If you look, though, for example, at a theatre, I don't believe personally that theatres will open this year. I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect I'm right, because, you know, most people aren't going to want to sit in a small enclosed space and travel there by underground and spend, you know, between 35 and £100 on a seat. I think we will have other priorities. So I would, and this, similarly, I would also worry about orchestras. You know, how many orchestras will survive this at the end of this pandemic? Live, you know, ballet dancers, if you don't keep a ballet dancer exercised, frankly, if you don't keep them with physiotherapists, with masseurs, with bar training, etc., you can't just fling open the door of a theatre the following week and say dance. So I think that we're looking at a really significant crisis going forward with our cultural institutions. And I think it's very difficult to imagine who, in terms of either individual philanthropists or the government or councils or the Arts Council, can possibly give them that, you know, lifeblood injection that they all need. So I think we'll be looking at a very different cultural landscape at the end of this.
And do you feel, Hannah, you know, you say that, you know, what's necessary is these great philanthropic organisations, institutions, you know, trusts should try to come together. I mean, as we both know, actually, one of the things that's quite difficult in philanthropy is coordinating that, because people have their own agendas, their pet projects, their relationships. You know better than me. Is it happening at the moment? Is there a sort of, you know, a cultural government of national unity that's coming into place, or all the old squabbles still in place?
No, I think what I've seen personally is I've seen a lot of major philanthropists come together to try and do something about, for example, vaccines, or funding vaccines, or funding some kind of testing. There, I think there has been a kind of coalescence, if you like, of philanthropy and philanthropists. What I haven't seen is the cultural sector coming together. And I think partly that's because there isn't leadership there. I know that Nick Sirota at the Arts Council is thinking of leading a group of philanthropists to try and discuss this. Now, whether he's managed to do that yet, I'm not sure. And I think partly it's because philanthropists, like any other member of the public, are slightly kind of shocked and kind of like, whoa, you know, how do we respond to this? You know, how do we navigate our way out of this? I think that, you know, they're like anyone else. You know, we're all in a state of, I think, advanced shock, terror, you know, indecision. You know, I think, aren't we all feeling that to some extent?
I think so, but I also think it's unleashing a freedom to think much more radically. You know, I'm struck here while you were talking, Hannah, Louise, and if I can come to Louise in a second, I will, says, you know, we should do what all other countries do, which is realise the importance of culture and so that we should stop relying on charity to fill this gap, and we should have a different level of state funding of culture. Louise, if I can, I'm going to come to you to make that point. There you are. Hello, Louise.
Hello. No, I mean, it's just I mean, England doesn't seem to have a sort of an appreciation of the arts, and this perhaps gives it an opportunity out of necessity, because, you know, we can't have, I mean, you know, as you say, theatre is dead for a year. And I mean, theatre in this country is so important. And so, yes, I mean, you know, the state could step in now and do it properly. I mean, I've got no sort of real argument. I mean, I can waffle about it, but I've got no sort of position, except that I am an artist and I know actors, and I used to work at the National, and I know that I know that Germany fully pays for 2 orchestras. So they've got the Royal Opera House and you've got 1 orchestra, and they're all run ragged. And they perform their performances on a shoestring. But in Germany, you have 2 full orchestras paid full time all the time to allow, you know, the musicians to be treated properly. So I mean, that's just an example that I know from sort of my private life. But I just think this country doesn't do culture, and here is an opportunity for it to have. It has to step in to save this. It shouldn't be left to charities, however honourable those charities are.
I'm going to come, Hannah. There are a bunch of hands up, so I'm actually going to come to a few people. Yelena, I think you just put your hand up. I'm going to ask you, if I may, to see if I can get your video on as well.
Yes, is that working?
Yes. There you are. Hello.
Hello. Thank you, firstly, for your speech so far. It's been really interesting. I just wanted to ask, with respect to widening access to the arts, because I think a lot of the, or from what I've heard as well, a lot of people have been worried with respect to making galleries more open to people, whether they're sort of the YouTube viewings that I've seen going around of different galleries as well. Do you think that that's something after the coronavirus that will change with respect to widening access across the UK for people who maybe can't get down to London or can't get to these certain galleries to see these things?
I know, I mean, speaking with my National Gallery hat on, that's something that we started or has been ongoing, and this crisis will accelerate that. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that galleries must be available and the contents must be available to people 24/7 wherever they live within the country. After all, the paintings of our national collections belong to the members of the British public, and the British public must be able to see them. And I think perhaps there are 1 or 2 plus sides of the crisis, if I dare say that there is a plus side, but so maybe I don't quite dare say that yet. But anyway, put it this way, we are accelerating online access. We are accelerating different ways of working. We are entering, if we are now in a 3rd industrial revolution, we're about to go into a 4th, or is this just a 3rd super plus? I'm not sure. But this connectivity, I think that we're now getting more used to online and across the net, to your point, will absolutely continue and must continue after things have gone back to normal.
It's interesting. Presumably, the difficulty you've got, and you will know this, Hannah, in the old sort of National Gallery role, is that you're always the back of the queue. If you come in as an arts organisation and you're saying, look, we need extra public funds, they say, yes, all very well, but have you noticed the NHS, national security, et cetera, et cetera? And that's going to be even more acute now. So can you talk a little bit about how else you think about it? You assume that you go to the government says, yes, we'll do what we can, but it's not going to be enough. Is there a different way? Do you think we're going to have to think about things like charging for gallery access? I know that has been a big discussion in the past. Do you think that we're going to cross a threshold as a result of this that we've talked about for a long time before, but haven't had the impetus to do that?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, and to I think Louisa, she was called, her point, I think she's absolutely right that the government should dig in its pocket at the moment and help the arts, because actually it's a tiny amount of money comparatively that the arts need. I can't remember the exact figures this second, but I can look them up. But if you look at, for example, what goes towards the arts now, it's a fraction, say, of a national health budget. And yes, it should be. That said, I do think that the arts have such a huge part to play in our health and well-being. So I think we can look at it that way. As far as how we might evolve, I think undoubtedly there's going to have to be more partnerships. So again, I have no crystal ball, but I would imagine that we won't have so many regional orchestras going forward, and we will have to find a way of working together. I can't believe that we will have quite so many theatres in London coming out of this. I can't see how they can keep body and soul together, quite honestly, on what is already very, very limited funding. So again, what could we do to work together? Yeah. What could we do to do more touring? What can we do more online? Unfortunately, what is likely to suffer, I think, are the outreach programs and education programs, because institutions have a duty of care, for example, towards their objects, and we're caught, aren't we, between a rock and a hard place. They need to sell tickets either to a performance or to an exhibition, but at the same time they need to prove their worth and to inspire the new generations of young viewers, listeners, attendees. But I think collaboration has to be the way forward.
I mean, as you're talking, Hannah, I'm reading this stream of things that would make you, they're actually really upsetting. I know we started this call by saying that we were going to be sort of uplifting and cheerful, but you look at this. Joe Murray has written in talking about concern about small theatres and museums, which have already been struggling, in towns like Clacton and Thurrock and places like that. And to Yelena's point about making sure wider access to the arts and culture, one of the big pushes of the Arts Council at the end of last year was to try to say, look, how do we get beyond London? The risk, of course, is that the economies of scale means that it actually all concentrates back into London and the big cities, and market towns, more remote areas don't have much access to culture at all.
Yeah, and I think we're also going to see a lot of empty buildings because, we've had a boom in some respects, a lot of people putting up new buildings, new galleries, new theatres, new whatever. And that just maintaining physical structures, I think, is going to be an issue. Again, I don't want to kind of, be presumptuous, but I cannot believe that a lot of these new super duper art centres are going to survive. I think, again, we're going to have to think of a different way of using some of these structures. And it may not just be for the arts. That may be that we'll do more of a kind of shared workspace from them. It may be that, there are lots of ways I think that we could look at how to use and share buildings, libraries, buildings, art centres, etc., etc.
I'd love to bring in Chris. Chris, if you're there, because Chris, Hannah, asked a question. If we'd had this, I keep thinking to myself, if you have these conversations and COVID hadn't happened, what would the conversation be about? And one of the question that Chris puts, or the point Chris puts, is that prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was increasing scrutiny of philanthropy, people like the Sacklers and corporate. Oh, there's Chris. There you are. Chris came, by the way. Chris helps run, in fact, I think you're the head, Chris, of an organisation called Culture Unstained. Yeah. And he was good enough to come to a thinking with us about whether or not the BP should fund the British Museum with Richard Lambert, the chair of the British Museum. So Chris, actually, it's brilliant that you asked this question because, of course, well, why don't you make your point and then let's discuss whether or not we're trying to have our cake and eat it.
Yeah, I mean, and it wasn't the way I tried to frame the question that I've just written down wasn't so much as a point, but really just an open question to you, Hannah, and also other people here. That there really was this momentum, whether it was the Sacklers and the kind of ethical dimensions of accepting money from them, or whether it was around the ethical acceptability of BP sponsorship given the urgency of the climate crisis. And it felt like that was really coming to the fore. And so I guess with this kind of real financial pressure I'm sort of just wondering where we find ourselves as we sort of emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm just wondering whether cultural institutions will kind of, that pressure of the financial necessity will outweigh also this sense that we want to like reinvent and reimagine what cultural institutions can be. And that maybe we actually want to take the opportunity to recenter this idea of being values-led institutions, because we're thinking about how we relate differently. We're thinking about what the purpose of culture is in a different way. And so actually those kind of ethics might be even more important than they were before. And I think, I don't know, I think it's an interesting question. I also don't want to rush to answer it in the sense of landing in one place or another, but I think, yeah.
No, I really like the way you put that. I'd love you to know, explain to me, when you say values-led, how do you think that, I mean, just to be blunt about it, how do you think we would pay for that values-led culture? How do you think that institutions, if they're going to change the way that they've been working so far, how do you think that they would change in order to meet those new criteria?
I guess it really is going to depend on the cultural institution. But I think really being much more outspoken. So if and holistic, I guess. So if accessibility, programming, work from BAME directors, writers, and so on is core to what you do, then maybe that needs to be reflected in your approach to funding. If you're doing a lot of work around sustainability and climate, then that should be reflected in how you operate and how you create work and so on. So I think it's about that kind of holistic approach that you kind of practice what you preach, I guess, in some way. And a lot of institutions are already, so I'm not sort of saying that as a... Yeah.
Chris, can I ask you though, a flip of that? Are you having second thoughts about the position that you've taken and that Culture Unstained has taken about things like energy company sponsorship of the arts in the light of the pandemic, thinking, look, the financial strains on the arts are going to be so great, you know, we can't make perfection the enemy of the good here. We've got to be able to work with companies and engage them in the public square about what they do, but not bar them from funding exactly the organisations that we most want to see thrive and we worry are going to actually collapse given the pandemic. Are you rethinking your views on this?
No, I would say that what Culture Unstained and others as an organisation have done is not sort of take against corporate sponsorship or philanthropy as a whole, but has always been about identifying specific kind of industries that we believe are sort of crossing an ethical red line. And I think I never want to draw too strong a distinction about it, but if we're thinking about what is the next major crisis we really need to prepare ourselves for, it is going to be climate. And that we do need to sort of think about what role do we want oil and gas companies to be playing as well. So I think it's actually a very small proportion of that funding that there's sort of a question about. And I think it's about, I really agree with Hannah about the importance of government support, because that pressure should not fall on the cultural institution to be having to compromise on the values and the ethics of what they do in their role in society. I think it's much more for government to give them that freedom and flexibility to make bold work and have that leading role in society.
It's interesting, by the way, Chris, that Eric Coots, who's put this point in the chat, that we do need to think about, you know, obviously the philanthropy element to this in the context of the, you know, corporate sponsorship too. I imagine that conversation is going to come back live and fully, you know, in the next few months. So, Susan Hill, you've had your hand up for a while. I think you may have done that in response to my initial question, but I just wanted to check whether you wanted to weigh in. If not, Hannah, I'm going to, because I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about your book, but also a little bit about your life and your family too. So the House of Trelawney, this is a handbrake term. You'll see the reason for it. There's one of the comments in the chat from frankly one of the world's great humans, Millie Soames, who says. Million handle know each other, who says, David Aronovich wrote last week in the Times of how the roaring 20s came on the heels of the Spanish flu pandemic. Can we look forward to something as exciting as this in the 20s? And given the House of Trelawney is actually about people who lived large and then see centuries of wealth and power sort of slip through their fingers, I just wondered whether or not you think there is something that's about to happen. You know, obviously you did quite a lot of work on the history before you got into the House of Trelawney. Do you think that there is going to be some kind of bounce back? Are we going to get out of this?
In terms of bad behaviour, which is cut the
bad behaviour. Yes,
really,
I don't want your predictions on the economy, but I want your predictions on behaviour. Where do you think it'll go?
Well, you know, it's funny you said, because I was looking at, for research, I'm doing something else, exactly this question about, oh, is that a child coming in? Or
no, that's Kate, my wife, just come in to say hi.
So actually, even as early as, and I've never pronounced his name very well, but Thucydides, if I'm right, you know, and he's writing about the plague of Athens. So that's in 400 BC or something. And he says, yes, it's the, you know, the plague of Athens led to a great bout of bad behavior. And we can see that again, obviously, with Boccaccio's Decameron. Again, you know, plague leads to really bad behavior. Spanish flu, I'm not sure if you can say the Roaring Twenties is definitely a thing, but there is no doubt about it that there is a kind of a very, very, very kind of intense reaction. We could probably all feel this now about being locked down and what happens after that. And again, Barbara Tuchman, if you haven't read it, anyone, this book that she's written called The Distant Veil is an extraordinary book about the calamitous 14th century. And she's also writing post-Black Death, you know, which killed, I think, a third of the world. And she's saying that from this, what everybody wants is to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And getting back to normal can be preceded by a bout of what James, I think, is referring to as kind of wild behaviour. So Millie Soames, in answer to your question, yes, and we are hoping that you might lead the bout of wild behaviour in Buckinghamshire.
But do you, I suppose, I mean, the reason I wanted to go there was actually to get you to talk a little bit about the House of Trelawney and you may want to describe the book a little bit, you'll do it much better than me, but there's obviously a sort of intriguing thing, Hannah, which is why you chose to write about a family that, you know, starts with essentially a large swathe of Cornwall and every building, every tract of land, every yacht named Trelawney, and then sees its power, its influence, its happiness in decline. What was it about that story that appealed to you?
Well, I think that, you know, civilizations do, don't they, inevitably decline, and families inevitably decline. And I mean, when I was younger, I don't think I'll ever be asked back again, but I would occasionally be asked to, you know, a weekend house party, and you would get an invitation from, you know, Lord and Lady something or Sir something and Sir something, and you'd go to their fabulous pile. You'd kind of drive up and there'd be this enormous kind of edifice in front of you. And it'd be very exciting. Gosh, I'm staying, you know, at something hall, you know, somewhere or other. And you'd get in there, and actually, once you got through the front door, I used to see that it wasn't quite the same as you thought it was going to be. And there was, if you happened to go not in July, you would quite often have to run as fast as you could between the dining room and the drawing room, because those were the only two houses that were heated. And you'd go, there was once one house I stayed in, and I was staying on the first floor, and there were 3 floors above where I was sleeping. And there were pots and pans and buckets all over the floor when I got into my bedroom. And I couldn't think why. And then it started to rain in the middle of the night. And I realized that actually the water was coming through 3 or 4 floors above me. So I was riveted, obviously, by why people want to maintain that lifestyle and our devotion to things and to matter and to houses and homes, even though we know that it might be bankrupting us, killing us, stopping us from having a life. And that was I think it's a metaphor as well as a personal experience. And I wanted to write about 2008, which for many people, you know, was for a huge amount of people was a terribly destructive time financially. But I think it was the death knell of various aristocrats in this country. After that, they couldn't keep it going anymore. And I think the Trelawneys were a metaphor, without being too long-winded about it. Which I have just seen, by the way.
No. I basically hold the lock on that in the world's most long-winded questions. I'm trying to put Jim Nofty out of business here. By the way, Jim Nofty's a brilliant person. I've realised I've just made a terrible national treasure. Hannah,
I'm sure he's not watching anyway.
the thing obviously that's sort of extraordinary to hear you say those things, and you say that families, families decline, wealth declines. Why is it that families choose to maintain a commitment to a legacy, to a name, to a set of buildings? You don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to think, oh, that's interesting, that you, given your life, your family's name, your commitment to Waddesdon Manor, the history of buildings that your extended family have built. Do you feel that way? Do you think, oh my goodness, when I get up in the morning, even before I've thought of what I want to do with my life, there is this responsibility to things that have that Rothschild name associated to them?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, as far as Waddesdon goes, so Waddesdon Manor is a house that our family built and then gave to the National Trust, in the 1870s. My God, I hope my father isn't listening. I'm going to get into such trouble if I get the date wrong. So 18, let's go, and now it's owned by the National Trust, but we still look after it. And yes, I do. It's not the first thing I think about instantly when I wake up in the morning, or most mornings anyway. But yes, I do. I feel there is a strong responsibility towards that house, but not just because it's a family house, but more because, it's a place where lots of people work. It's a place where 500,000 people come and enjoy every year, where we do lots of education programs, etc., etc. So it's more that it's come to mean something else to us. I think at the heart of your question is, do I think that I should keep my own family going? Is that what you're saying? Or
No. I'm saying, it's not a question about your own family. It's a question of what it's like. Most of us don't grow up or don't come into adulthood with a set of expectations that are predetermined for us. And you've obviously taken a good deal of those on. And then forced you to think about what the purpose of these, without being sort of, grand about it, what these big families are for, what these families do, and it does fall to you, and I wonder how you think about that.
Well, I think, and I know, please don't think it's going to sound so pompous, but I think with great privilege comes responsibility, and I think that being born as I was into this family and having as many privileges as I have enjoyed, whether it was wealth or whether it was education or opportunity, etc., etc. You have to give back. It's really simple. You can't just sit around thinking, oh, aren't I lucky? You just have to then do something with it, and that's just how I look at it.
So tell us a little bit then about how you think about what the family, on the back of this, you and your family will do next, because I suppose that the opportunity now is for all of us is to rethink a little bit about how we live our lives, what we think our priorities are, how the society that we live in works. And maybe I note what you said right at the beginning, that it's actually really pretty traumatic what we're dealing with at any level. Obviously people have got very, very painful things they're living through, but how much are you reconsidering, thinking about, okay, what comes next as a result of all this?
I think as far as Waddesdon goes and our immediate family, it's, we have to think about what are the core values. I think we all perhaps need to rethink about what our core values are and what really matters. So I think in terms of Waddesdon, Waddesdon is a very, very unique house, which has an extraordinary collection and a depth of knowledge in an area which many other places in this country don't have, namely the French 18th century. That's perhaps its speciality. So I think going forward, what we have to do is to really preserve what we're good at and what we think is really important. Mm-hmm. And some things which I think we're less good at, which may have to fall by the wayside, but I think for all of us, and certainly I think in my own personal life, what are my core values and where do I want to, deploy my energies now? Mm. And I think that's exactly what we'll do across the board, whether we're talking about investment, philanthropy, Waddesdon, blah, blah, blah.
All right, I'm going to come before this thing has ended, because I know that you're also involved in the business and the investment firm, and I do want to get a sense of what you think about that, because we are trying to get a sense of how the world is going to bounce back or rub along after all of this. But there are a couple of people who've got their hands up. My colleague Tessa Murray's got her hand up. Tess, can I come to you?
Hi.
Hey, Tessa.
Hi, Nessie. Hello. I was just thinking about something that we've been talking about a lot at Tortoise, which is the fact that this crisis hasn't been a great leveller that some people purport it to be. And in terms of shining a very bright light on the widening kind of gap in terms of people who have access to capital and people who don't. And I just wonder if we're going to see more punitive wealth taxes, more distribution of wealth, more wealth consumed within a generation. So actually kind of legacy issues become less and less of an issue. And how we make sure that the sort of the philanthropic response is as progressive as the political response needs to be.
I wouldn't know how to begin to answer that question. It's much James, you want to have a go at that?
No, but I mean, for what it's worth, while you gather your thoughts, Hannah, I'll just make a point that one of the conversations that's been going on in the chat while you've been speaking has been this point that people are making, which is not just sort of, you know, the Rothschilds, the sort of established families and philanthropists, yeah, but particularly, you know, entrepreneurs who've come into money saying to themselves, how do I make sure that in this context I have real impacts? And I do think, you know, the point that Tess is making is that it's exactly right. There is an expectation now about the reach, and, you know, we did a big piece about philanthropy a few weeks back, which was about not just the authenticity of the philanthropy, the purpose of it rather than the virtue signaling, but actually the effectiveness of it, actually how effective it was. And I suppose on arts and culture, you know, that's, it's not new to you, but I imagine that's a big thing, which is, you know, who's it reaching and what's it for?
Yeah. Well, firstly, to our point about the disparity between the rich and the poor, yes, I mean, it's one of the, you know, this crisis has shown, or in great relief, you know, the disparity in culture and the disparity in people's incomes and opportunities and how safe you are, and that's obviously something which worries everybody. And if you've got 26+ million Americans out of work, and you've got, you know, people queuing for miles and miles and miles for food banks, that is a desperate situation that I think nobody would want to witness, but we are witnessing. As far as what philanthropists can do, I think we have seen some quite kind of comforting, if you like, for want of a better word, reactions. So you see Gates giving 100 million, Jack Dorsey giving $1 billion, the Rousings giving up to, I think it's 16 million to the National Health, and so on and so forth. And then I think actually, as importantly as the big totemic names, you turn on the BBC and you see 28 million plus being given by everybody, you know, perfectly, you know, by television viewers. And philanthropy isn't just about the very, very wealthy. Philanthropy is about everybody doing something to help them, to help other people. So one of my daughters, Clemency, for example, set up a Just Giving page to help feed kids in Greenwich. And for £3.50, you could feed one child per week. And she aimed it at her generation. She's a student. And guess what? You know, she raised nearly £9,000. So I think that the way that we look at philanthropy shouldn't be so dichotomized. I think everybody can be a philanthropist. They don't necessarily have to give money. We as a society need to give time, we need to give money, we need to give skills, and that's probably the most healing thing we can do together.
I'm struck, Daniel Dahl-Steinberg has made a point in the chat, Hannah, which is, I think, so interesting and worth talking about, thinking about. I may come to him if he's there, which is actually the opposite of the point that Louise was making, and to an extent the opposite of the point, or maybe a complementary point to the one that you were making, which is that actually part of the issue here is also about how we empower philanthropy and we empower foundations. I don't know if Daniel's there, but this is also about the tax system going out of it. Hello there.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Yeah, thanks, James. You pretty much said my point, which is, you know, taxation is not a very good form of philanthropy. I mean, taxation is there to provide public services, but the super rich have shown, and going back many, many years, that when they create foundations, which they tend to like doing because, you know, people's lives are finite, but foundations last forever and make a name. You know, so you do see Gates and Buffett creating these $100 billion, $200 billion. And I think the Gates Foundation is several $100 billion with all the people that have put in. But it's managed by somebody who has goals and does not waste it. And I think that's a really important differentiation. And I actually think the Rothschilds did pretty well with this. They, you know, as was mentioned, you know, Waterston is an amazing place. It's open to the public, and it's a collection that is incredible because it was managed privately for a while.
Yeah. Oh, well, Hannah, you there? Yeah.
Yeah, I can't take personal credit for that, but thank you very much for your affirmation. It's nice to hear.
But Hannah, I know there are lots of other people who've got points to make about philanthropy, but you just want to pick up on the central idea there that we don't really resolve. The argument that's made in the UK often is that the US is much more focused on big money donations from philanthropists. As a result, it works much more effectively in terms of securing big investments in the arts, in culture, in science, and that the UK really struggles to get that kind of commitment, and that the problem does sit to an extent in our business culture and in our system of taxation. I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of stuff, isn't it? I mean, the American system is much more tax advantageous, particularly because you can write it off during your lifetime, whereas here it's easier to write it off after your lifetime. I think, secondly, that the American social life and social system revolves much more around charity and charitable giving. You know, that it is, you know, the super rich, as we know. Their life and their giving is all part of one thing on the whole. I think that's slightly changing now with the tech world, but certainly, you know, in kind of recent past. I think also remember that the Americans are much, much more wealthy than we Brits are. I mean, there aren't that, when I was at the National, it was the same 5 families who gave over and over and over and over again. And I don't think that's because people were mean. I think that actually we're just, you know, the kind of wealth that you see in America isn't the same here. That said, I think that people could and should do a lot more. I really believe that. I think there are an awful lot of people who give disgracefully little, and they should really come out and do an awful lot more. And crises like this present a golden opportunity. It doesn't matter if today is the first day you give £1, make today the first day, and make tomorrow the £10, and so on.
And we can't just press you on that, because I worry that saying that, and people have said that for a long period of time, you know, why is it that some of Britain's wealthiest people don't give in the same way that they do in the US, that people are not going to suddenly turn over a new leaf, and whether or not what you actually need to do here is change the expectations of the wealthiest people in society, rather than just, if you like, sort of pressure them, even shame them, or hope for the best.
So what do you mean, carrot or stick? Are you going to, well, I mean, you can do a mixture of both. I don't think one should kind of have sidebars of shame about people, because that's probably not going to get them to give. But you can do a combination of both praise and the other. And I think going back to the point about toxic philanthropy, as we call it, I think, you know, which is talking about BP or the Sacklers, there was a danger in that, which I would like just to kind of raise, which is that the more public scrutiny there is around naming and shaming different kinds of philanthropists, the less likely people are to give. And you're seeing a proliferation in America of people setting up, as one of your contributors said, private institutions. In 2015, I think there were 317 new private museums, for example. And that's, I think, a lot because people didn't want to be held accountable. So I think we have to be very careful about how we deal with this subject, I would just say, because I think you can put a lot of people off. The public scrutiny can put people off.
The interesting thing is, you know, coming from the world that I've lived in, you know, the media, you know, it was always very clear that the news pages ran certain things and the advertisers were on the advertising pages. And actually, it didn't mean that you were endorsed by your advertisers, actually quite often you'd be off investigating those companies that advertise. How do you create a culture that is visible to the public, Hannah, where people have the confidence that the contents of that cultural institution is entirely separate from its funding streams, that there is that there's not, that if you're not wrapping yourself in the flag of a company or its agenda when you're running a cultural organization?
Look, I personally, and I don't expect everyone to agree with this, but I think if Mr. X or Miss X decides to give 50 million or 100 million to a museum and in return wants his or her name on it, I don't see that's a big problem, personally. I mean, I think, if they've earned the money and they've, legally, et cetera, why shouldn't they do it? And why should they get castigated for it? Now, and that has been the same from the Medici, the moment that art became portable.
Yeah.
People have built museums and shrines to themselves, and it's the same with philharmonics or whatever. So I don't see that in itself. If you've worked bloody hard your whole life to then get your name or get public recognition for money that you give away, I don't see that that's a problem. I don't feel that people should be castigated. There are lines, obviously, when you get money which has been made from other people's misery, if you like, just to do a kind of Daily Mail headline, which is then going on a wall. And that is quite right that is scrutinised. But I'm slightly going off I'm slightly kind of going off piste here, but I do think that we have to be careful about allowing people to get credit for money they've made and spending it in the way that they want to, if it's for public good.
Can I, we've got just a few minutes left. I said at the end, I'll try to come to a little bit about the life we're seeing in lockdown. Firstly, we've been trying in the course of these conversations with as many people as possible to gather tips on how to live well. I'll share with you some of the best ones. Tom Watson, the former deputy leader of the Labour Party, said that what he did was he plugged in a sort of playlist of songs that ran all the time in his home, and every time Bob Marley came along, he had to get up and do 10 press-ups, 10 squat thrusts, and 10 sit-ups or something. So this was his fitness regime. Someone else, Julia Samuel, said it was just all about breathing. Breathe in 7, breathe out 11. Do you have any particular sort of tips for all of us here thinking to ourselves, okay, how do we keep ourselves in good spirits even when it's a Monday and even when there's a global coronavirus crisis?
I do secretly dance in my bedroom, I have to say.
I'm hoping do you want to give us any to which particular?
Well, it depends. One of my daughters is a great collector of music, and she keeps sending me Spotify things, so that I try and put. She doesn't know this actually. I don't know if she's listening or not, but I'll put my earplugs in when no one's watching, and I mean no one is watching, and I'll choose whatever one of the tracks she sent me, and I'll have a good dance to it. And I think that no one's watching. Dance as if no one's watching, and boy, nobody's watching. My other children might be able to hear me thumping on the floor below or above, but that helps. I'm lucky enough to be in the country, so I spring watch. I never thought I'd ever say that, but there's a wonderful app called Picture This, and you go and you take a photograph of something a tree or a shrub, and then every day I have to learn a new tree or a flower or a shrub. I don't know. Julia would know better than I had.
Are you learning a different plant, a different?
Yeah. Today I learned all about something called a red campion, which, may I tell you, was actually bright pink, rather confusingly. By
the way, the pull of the botanists in your family is going to be, one of those.
I think I've come too late to this particular discipline, but no, I think that something like that is quite fun.
And Hannah, what about more sort of pragmatically and seriously? Obviously, you're also engaged in the family's business, in the investment firm, in RIT, and a lot of people look at it and think, look at the world and think they can't make sense of it, and specifically they can't make sense of the markets, and they think, hang on a second, it seems calamitous, the economy looks like it's on a long, low trajectory, and yet the markets in many ways seem more buoyant than make sense. I know that you're not on haven't joined us to give financial advice here, but
do not take any financial advice from me.
but how do you read it? How when you're, you know, also partially responsible for investment funds, do you think about that and find you get the best advice to make the best judgments in such an uncertain time?
Well, listen, I'm very lucky. I've got, you know, my father, Jacob, who's a terrific entrepreneur and has lived through many, you know, I don't think he'd mind me saying he's of a certain age, so he's not new to a financial crisis. So I see and talk to him every day, and we talk about what's going on in the market. So that's one piece of advice. And then I think that, you know, at RIT, which is the investment trust which he set up, which I'm still on the board of, we are lucky that we've got some very sensible, rational people who are trying basically not to capture the upside, but are trying basically to protect us against the downside. And anyone, I believe, and this is something I have learned, anyone who says they know what's going to happen next or why something's happened, I think you should just discount that immediately, because I don't think anybody knows what's going on in the financial markets. I don't think anyone thinks that what is going on and the recent, you know, recoveries and collapses, you know, have made any sense. And anyone who says, right, well, I know what's going to happen next, I would just block your ears. I just think nobody knows at the moment what's going to happen. It doesn't make any sense. The big uplift again doesn't make any sense to any of the people who I talk to, whose opinion I trust. And they all say the same thing.
And that means that you're quite bearish about what's going to happen for quite some time.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, I don't think, I'm certainly bearish about it, and the people I listen to are bearish about it. And without a shadow of a doubt, the measures which we and the rest of the Western world are taking will have a very serious knock-on effect on our economies for a long time to come. I mean, that's the one thing I think we do all know.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're coming towards the end of time, and you and possibly we have singularly failed to be upbeat as we come to the end of this.
I know.
But the one thing you would say about that, Hannah, is that in these circumstances where it's very hard to know what's going to happen, that we may be here for quite some time, it could possibly be quite a good environment to write another book.
Oh.
And so, but I know a lot of people find that actually, for some reason, even though they've got the time and they are kind of locked in, that they can't be creative at all.
You know, it's terrible, because if you'd asked me what my dream was, you know, a few months ago, I'd have said it would be to lock down with my new book, you know, not to have to go, you know, on a tube to work in the morning, etc., etc. I say, you know, this, and of course the actual reality of it is, it doesn't really work like that. I mean, I find that, you know, words are like, you know, very fragile bits of glass that, you know, I put them on a page and they break and then they shatter. And my concentration is, unfortunately, is very fractured. I can't resist plugging into the, you know, my 5 favorite news channels or newspapers to see, you know, what the latest disaster is. And I wish I had more self-discipline. Maybe I will make a commitment tonight on air. All right, tomorrow I will not check the news until 6 o'clock. How's that? And maybe I will write a book.
But maybe, well, you know, if a great novel comes of this, that, you know, just... You know,
I'll give you a credit, James.
That's on us. That's on us. If you know me, you know I've had a lifelong struggle with punctuality, but we're going to try to make sure that we end on time. I wanted just to say that, you know, when we hold these think-ins, part of the aim is just to, you know, to get to know people, to do that great thing that we journalists get to do, which is have access to extraordinary people and hear a little bit about their lives and how they see things. It's also an attempt to try to take something that will drive our journalism forward. And, you know, and Hannah, a serious thank you, because as well as sort of making us think about books and great families and absurd stately homes where there's no heating, and also giving us, I think, quite a realistic, if bearish, grip on the economy, and giving us a sense of what it's like to try and run a cultural institution and an eye for ones that are obviously much smaller and struggling. I do think you've given us a pointer on a piece of journalistic work that we really do need to do, which is around the scale of the arts and cultural crisis in this pandemic. And I know a lot of people who joined us this evening are, you know, personally engaged in, as I've seen from the chat, some small charities, some larger arts organizations. You can just sense the scale of the concern. And I think the points that we've heard this evening about how do we look to the public funds, to government, how do we look to the system of taxation, how do we look to corporate partnerships and philanthropic partnerships through this, I think there's a piece of work for us at Tortoise to try and take away so we can understand it in more detail. We have, as you may have seen, you know, this daily email called the Sense Maker, which we send to everybody. And one of the things we're doing is trying to focus that Sense Maker on specific issues. Last week, we looked at oil. This coming Friday, we've got a Sense Maker Live that looks at vaccines and therapies. What I think we should do is try and have a focused look at arts and culture, and we'll try and bring people together to say what can be done so that something constructive comes out of this. But from me and from everyone at Tortoise, a huge and heartfelt thank you to you, Hannah. A great thank you to everyone on the call. Hannah, there's a sort of awkward thing here, which is if you'd come to our newsroom, we would have all given you a round of applause and a warm glass of wine. In the absence of those things, all we can do is wave at you and say thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, thank you, everyone. Wave goodbye. Good night. Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.